All right. Hey everyone. So today we're going to talk about everything from queer representation to accessibility in video games. I have the wonderful pleasure of being joined today by Laura Kate Dale, also known as Laura K. Buzz. She is an author, accessibility and queer consultant, YouTuber, podcaster, video game critic, Twitch streamer, and so much more. She has a YouTube channel with over 300 videos on topics ranging from video game accessibility, video game news, representation, and critiques. She's worked for or freelanced for various media outlets, including Polygon, IGN, Vice, and Kotaku. She has several podcasts, including the Podquisition, Dice Funk, Queer and Pleasant Strangers, and Tonal Whiplash. She's also published multiple books, including Gender Euphoria, Uncomfortable Labels, Who Hunts the Whale, and Things I Learned from Mario's Butt. Thank you so much for taking
I
the time to be here.
thank you for having me. And yeah, I've done a lot of things in my time on the internet. I apparently just can't pick a topic. I'm like just gonna make everything all the time.
I love it. It's like I feel like you'll never be bored with all the projects you have going on.
Exactly. As someone with ADHD, I just let myself follow the dopamine. As soon as it's like, oh, I have a new idea of something that would be fun, cool, I'll make that happen too.
Perfect. So we'll kind of start like big picture as I do with most of the people I interview. Like we'll jump into some of these projects and some later questions, but wonder just like kind of starting broadly, could you tell us a little bit about yourself to help the audience get a sense of who you are, just in case for those of you that might not be familiar with you, your background, and your work.
So yeah, as you said, my name's Laura Kate Dale. I have been a full-time, I guess, media critic for the last 10 or so years. I came into this career from no kind of formal background. I just love talking to people about the things that I felt passionate about. I remember growing up, I loved playing video games growing up, but just as much as that, I loved talking to people about video games and having conversations about them. And all of the various projects I've done over the years have basically been different forms of I have a lot of thoughts and opinions, and I just like sharing them with people. I started doing video game critique about a decade ago. At the time, there were not a lot of trans people who were openly out and in the video game critique space, and it was a cho- being out as trans at the time was a choice I made very much just out of I know what the internet's like, and the internet will try and find these things out whether you want them to or not. So I was like, I'm just gonna take the
Mhm.
power away and just be open from the start. But over the years, I have gone from fairly standard here is a review and what I think about video games through to at this point, most of what I do is focused on accessibility. I publish weekly videos about accessibility in video games, focused on what games are doing things well and poorly in regards to supporting disabled players and how we can move the industry forward toward being more generally accessible more of the time for more people with more disabilities.
And this kind of like jumps into one of my next questions. I know a lot of work ties into your identities and experiences, related to being a trans woman with autism, being queer. I think, about my own path into the work I've done on YouTube and in psychology and how much that was connected to my identities and experiences. So I wondered if you could speak a little to like how your identities have informed like your path on the projects you've done, being like a full-time creator, your perspectives on things like the video game industry.
As someone that grew up without seeing a lot of people talking about the kind experiences like my own, I understood the value of talking about my experiences so that other people could feel less alone and see, oh, there's someone else who has experiences like mine, and have that sort of sense of connection. And over the years, I've had a lot of really lovely messages from people who have said it was really helpful that you were talking about your experiences. I didn't see anyone else talking about those at the time, and it was really, really beneficial. But also, particularly in the early years of my career, I was very cautious of not wanting to be pigeonholed. and not wanting that to be the only kind of writing I got to do. And that is a tricky thing, I think, for anyone of any kind of minority background, is not just becoming that person that an outlet only wants to sign off on freelance pitches from when the pitches fit into that one background that we like you writing about. And I think over time I've gotten less worried about that. And I think that part of that has come from like the fact that I've had some career stability. The fact that a decade in I'm still doing this has reassured me there is space for me to talk about my identity, and I can then go and talk about other things, and I have enough people supporting my work that I can hop around projects, and I don't have to be too laser focused in on one topic. But
Mm.
it is definitely something I thought about a lot when starting out, was not wanting to only be allowed to write if it was about aspects of my identity, because I have so many other opinions I want to talk about.
Right. There's just so many other aspects about who we are as people.
Yeah.
But yeah, people tend to hyper focus on those specific pieces.
Yeah, people like having a very well-defined box that they can say, you're the writer of that background who
Mhm.
writes about the things that you are.
So, a lot of your work, as you've talked about, is connected to the video game industry. You spoke to this a little bit, but the video game industry, putting it lightly, has not always had the greatest track record when it comes to women, queer people, trans people, people of color, basically insert any and all minority and marginalized identities. So I'm wondering, like, how have your experiences been, and if you could speak a little more, being like a queer trans woman in a typically like male dominated cis het profession. At least that's what we often see.
Yeah. I think things are infinitely better today than they used to be. When I first started writing about video games as a career, I could count the number of trans women or trans people generally in the games industry who I knew about on one hand, and still probably count them each of those people a second time on that one hand and still be fine. There really wasn't a lot of people to look to for solidarity, or people to look to for examples of what to expect. I knew the industry was going to be a little bit harsh. I knew it was a bit of a traditional boys' club. I knew that there was not a lot of openly visible queer, particularly trans representation at the time. And the the way I sort of thought about things was I was very aware from friends I had who'd come out as queer in various ways online around the time I was coming out, that if you try and enter a space like video games, particularly where there are like very culture intense men who are very online involved, um, you don't get to keep aspects of yourself private for very long. I was very aware of friends who had been like harassed, who had been doxxed by places like 4chan, Kiwi Farms, and my approach was just, I don't want this to be something that people can try and hold over me and go, oh, we're going to reveal that you're trans and keep it secret. I was like, I'll just lean into it. And I've had people who've said, "Oh, it was really helpful seeing you be out and visible and loud about the fact you were trans when you were first in the industry." And I was like, I wish I could say I did it for any kind of, trying to help other people. I was like, it was entirely for me and entirely for trying to defend myself and just go, I'm just not going to give other people the power to use that against me. It's certainly been rough at points over the years. I have had times where I've been doxxed. I've had times where I've been harassed. I've had some rough experiences, and I don't want to get too deep into the weeds on
Yeah.
them, but I I think that while, there are rough times right now for trans people generally, societally, I think that the video game industry has really come a long way. And I think that some of the worst years the video game industry had in terms of like peak poor treatment of women and queer people in the industry during times like Gamergate, I
Mhm.
think did open a lot of eyes to a lot of like cis straight white men in the industry of there are a lot of people being treated pretty badly and we probably need to get our act together and pay attention to it. And it does feel like things are a lot better today.
Mhm. So you say you've noticed a shift for the positive in the past few years compared to
Oh,
like where things were previously.
definitely. We've reached a point now where I try and keep on top of like other queer women in the industry. I keep try and keep on top of the good work being done by other trans women in games
Mhm.
writing. I can't keep track of everyone anymore. It's reached a point
That's a
where like
good thing.
there are constantly I'll find out there's someone else doing really interesting work that I hadn't heard about, and I'm like, this is wonderful. The fact I can't keep track of you all is progress.
Yes. As opposed to being on one hand, like you mentioned earlier,
Yeah.
like very different. Kind of before I jump into some of like more of the video game specific questions, because I'm a huge video game nerd and part of the reason I wanted to talk to you. Yeah, I was curious about, what your role, like I've see the title of a queer and accessibility consultant on some of your bios. And, I was just curious as to like what has this role entailed for you?
So I have to be a little indirect with how I talk about some of this stuff because a lot of the projects I've done work on aren't projects that have surfaced yet, which
Sure.
is the fun of doing these kind of projects. But in terms of accessibility consulting, the last couple of years I've been lucky enough to have a number of game developers reach out to me, specifically, usually to be like, we have a video game that is pretty early in development, and these are the accessibility features we would like to implement, and how we plan to implement them, and why, and some sort of mock ups of what they're thinking. And they will sort of ask me, like, what in here looks good? What could be better? Are we following best practices for like, maybe there's a particular feature they want to implement that other developers have done, and they'll say, we took our inspiration from this game. Are there games that are doing it better that we should be looking at instead as our inspiration?
Mm.
And basically, I will go through and try and help identify which things they're looking at are likely to offer the most support to the most people for the sort of scope they have,
Yeah.
and helping identify people that they can reach out to who might be more specialized for certain topics that would be worth also getting into later in the project, see whether what they're trying is working in practice. In terms of queer consulting, largely those projects have been games where usually people who are not personally involved in a background of a character they are writing,
Mm.
typically a cis straight white man writer on a project wants to have, say, a queer or trans character or an autistic character or whatever, background of character, and usually will have already written, at the very least, an outline of where a story's going, and will
Mm.
go, here's what I've got right now. Is there anything that's raising red flags? Is there anything that I could add that would improve this story, or anything that is a little too specific or not sort of generally applicable enough? And I will go through and try and sort of shepherd what is working, what is not, and help point characters in directions that might work a little better. Both of those roles are basically just doing what I can to take work that has already begun on
Mhm.
projects and trying to help point it in a good direction.
It's so important to have that to make sure the representation and accessibility is as good as it can be.
And I'm really glad that more and more people are seeking people to ask those questions and not just
Mhm.
going, it'll probably be fine, and trying to push it through on their
Yeah,
own.
and it often isn't when they do that. Kind of jumping, like I said, into, you mentioned a lot of your work is in video game accessibility these days, and that's actually how I first came, across you and your content is through your YouTube channel. I think I first came across it like 2 or 3 years ago, and I was just like, I've never seen content like this before. Um, so I was wondering, could you tell us a little bit about what motivated you to start getting like in the area of creating content around accessibility, specifically in video games?
Yeah. as I said, I've been writing about various things, particularly video games, for the better part of a decade now. And
Hmm.
while, early on there was a lot that was very exciting about just getting to have a game early and write my general thoughts on it and post them at the same time as everyone else's embargo lifts. Over the years, there have been points where I've been a little disillusioned with the video game industry, particularly the last maybe 4 years or so. There has been a real growing trend of more and more stories coming out of video game development companies having really bad working practices and very poor treatment of workers. And the list of video game studios that I've had to morally wrestle with whether I can morally just sit and play and enjoy their games guilt-free has grown exponentially. And it's really changed my relationship with how I write about games and what I want to focus on. When a lot of the news around this industry is terrible treatment of workers, it feels almost a little unimportant to be sitting and writing one of maybe 20 reviews that will go up that day of the same game saying whether it's fun to play or not. And I still have passion to talk about to do that kind of work, but I had a day where I just sat down and I went, I want to be writing something about games that feels more substantial. Part of the thing about writing online in spaces like media critique is that everything you create feels a little intangible. Um, you publish a review, and there's a big rush of people that read it the day that it goes up, and then it trails off almost entirely, and a lot of people will forget it was ever written. And that's
Hmm.
sort of why I got into writing books, but it's also what led to a lot of the accessibility content I went into doing. Was I wanted to do something that felt like it was providing tangible advice that could be acted upon, that could have a practical effect on making games, better, playing games a better experience for more people. And that felt like something that might, have more of a lasting impact. And as someone who has struggled with video games at various points in my life because of varying disabilities, there was a little bit of self-interest in it and a little bit of like, I know that I already struggle with games, and as I age, that's only going to become more of a problem. But also, the world is so much larger than me, and there are so many other categories in which video games can be difficult for people. It it just felt like something I could be doing that might actually make the industry I love move in a good direction.
Yeah, I love that. Kind of just increasing access to more people to, so many people love video games, and why
Yeah,
not have it so more people can play and enjoy them?
there's a medium I love. Why wouldn't I want more people to be able to have more fun with it?
Exactly. So, kind of getting into the specific games, like, I've seen you talk about accessibility throughout a bunch of series, like small and large. Like, I've seen like Pokemon and Resident Evil and The Last of Us, like some really big, like, names in the field. Um, I wonder if you have any like examples, like what would you say are like some examples of like the best examples of accessibility settings that have been employed in games, settings maybe that you believe should be enacted more broadly.
I think that as common as an answer as this probably is in accessibility in games discussions, I think that The Last of Us Part 2 really did set a benchmark for a lot of what I would consider ideal standards for what the video game industry should be aiming towards. There have been games that have done things better in other regards, but I think that as a like broad blanket statement, that game did a really good job of establishing things like having presets for different common categories of disability, having like, here is a preset that will turn on settings useful for players with vision disabilities, hearing disabilities, motor disabilities, having really good customization of difficulty, introducing things like high contrast mode, where unimportant game elements are turned grayscale and important game elements are highlighted in very easy to see vibrant colors. The game had a bunch of really good features for being able to navigate using only audio, being able to navigate a 3D space if you aren't able to see the screen. While there are other settings that other games have done better, there are other innovations that I would really love to see grow. Um, that game really got like 95% of the way to, if every game could be like that, we'd be most of the way through making games accessible for most people. I want to give some nods to some other smaller titles, though, or some other
Mhm.
titles that I think are doing things really well. There is a recently released side-scrolling point-and-click adventure game called Brock the Investigator, who is an alligator investigator going and solving crimes. Not only did this game take a lot of inspiration from things like The Last of Us in terms of high contrast mode, it is one of the first video games I can point to that has start to finish audio descriptions for everything that happens.
Wow.
Not only is it playable if you cannot see the game, you like The Last of Us Part 1, you could play through the whole game if you could not see the screen, but you missed out on a big part of what the story was about.
Mhm.
The Part 1 remake of The Last of Us that recently released had some audio descriptions, but they were very inconsistent. But Brock the Investigator, every scene, every character, everything was described as audio, and that is a wonderful step forward. Forza Horizon 5 last year had British and American Sign Language interpreters on screen, which is something that's very rarely seen in games.
Wow.
Outside of specific individual games, I'm really glad to see that video game console stores having accessibility tags on games so that people who are
Mm.
browsing for games can see what accessibility settings are there before they make a purchase. That's recently just been added to PlayStation. It's been on Xbox for about a year now. I'm really glad to see that moving towards becoming a standard. But yeah, those would be the ones that jump to mind that I think right now are setting the standard for where the industry should be going.
Thinking from the other end, are there particular examples that stick out for you in terms of games that kind of miss the mark when it comes to accessibility and kind of like why that is?
In terms of individual games, Final Fantasy 16,
Mm.
which a lot of settings in that game that will be useful for disabled players have been deliberately limited in your ability to access them.
Mm.
Rather than putting them as just settings in your settings menu that you can pause the game and go turn on if they are settings that would help you to play that game, they are instead equipable rings that have to be slotted onto your character. There
Oh,
are not enough slots to use all of the accessibility settings at once. And any equipment slots that you use for accessibility settings are slots that you can't use for things that would power up your character. So you are having to sacrifice character build to get access to those
mm.
accessibility settings. And the way that the developers have talked about that decision as something where they were trying to actively discourage players from using those settings or encouraging them to get over their need for those settings
Oh,
is just really disappointing. It feels like a very hostile view that does not take into account that disabled people exist. But outside of like individual game examples, my answer to this is probably Nintendo as a publisher and console manufacturer is really falling like noticeably behind Microsoft and Sony in terms of accessibility.
hmm.
They are the only one of the three console manufacturers now to not have announced their own first party accessibility controller.
Hmm.
They tend to rely very heavily on motion controls with no non motion control alternatives in several games. Um, they do not. They do not have any degree of standards for what you can expect out of one of their games in terms of accessibility. If
Yeah.
you pick up an Xbox or a PlayStation 5 game today, that's a first party game developed by Sony or Microsoft, those games you can predictably go, most Sony first party games have these settings, most Xbox first party games have these settings, you know what to expect. Nintendo, it's a game by game complete roll
Right.
of the dice. Usually there are very few settings, if any. Nintendo just seems to have not stepped up to the plate to take this as a conversation seriously yet, and
Hmm.
it's becoming more and more obvious as time goes on, and Sony and Microsoft really start moving towards standardization of settings as a future for themselves.
Yeah, be really curious to see what, if anything, Nintendo does, because I feel
Well,
like Nintendo always has the creative peripherals, but not always
yes,
accessible.
it has been a long-term problem for them, and I really hope that something clicks for them eventually.
Kind of like thinking forward, what do you see are there like any important settings or aspects of game development that you feel like haven't really been considered or haven't been considered to their like full potential at this point?
I think that we're largely seeing most of the common groups of disability category being catered to some degree when we're looking at games like, say, PlayStation first party titles. One of the big ones that comes to mind is photo people with photosensitivity conditions such as epilepsy.
Hmm.
Usually, photosensitive gamers will get a warning at the start of a game that says, "Warning: this game has flashing lights," and that same game
That's
will
it.
offer no degree of settings to lessen the amount of flashing lights and camera shakes and whatever else is going on. There's a lot of settings that I see that are being offered that are helpful to people with cognitive disabilities, but
Mm-hmm.
are very rarely discussed as such and very rarely deliberately tailored to people with cognitive disabilities. Things like there's very little deliberate thought being put in by developers about how to support gamers with memory conditions, with difficulty reading, with difficulty holding information mentally in sort of like short-term memory while using
Yeah.
it. I see. I'm starting to see conversations happen around autism
Hmm.
and video games, and there have been some interesting discussions around that. An example of a game that tried to do something a few years ago that it's one of the first games that I saw like make a deliberate effort was Life is Strange True Colors, which had
Okay.
options to warn players before bright flashes of light or loud, intense increases in sound. If there was going to be drastic changes in sensory information, the game could warn you about that.
Hmm.
And that's been an interesting one to see conversations start bubbling up around. In terms of like the big categories of motor control conditions, vision, and hearing, I think those three are generally being like understood to be important pillars, and I think it's anything around outside of those that is taking a bit more time to catch on.
It sounds like a big piece right now is just getting more and more developers
Well,
incorporating more accessibility settings.
that's it. It's sort of a attack on two fronts. It's getting what we have examples of being done really well and saying this is a really good blueprint, aim for these, but it's
Hmm.
also trying to talk to the more ambitious developers and say what you've done in, say, this game is fantastic. These are things that no one's doing right now that you could be at the forefront of, and
Yeah,
trying to encourage not just following the blueprint of whatever the current big example of a good accessible game is, and trying to do new things that people haven't tested yet, and try and offer new options.
diverging a little bit into like one of your other areas, like queer and trans representation, but in video games still. Um, this is a very broad question that I can imagine could have its whole video, multiple videos. But what are your current thoughts on the state of queer and trans representation in video games? Like, as we've kind of touched on, like in many ways, the video game industry has improved in many ways over the past couple of years, especially. I'm wondering what do you think in 2023, the state of the industry?
So, as you say, I could go on about this for a long time. I think I recently gave like an hour-long talk just on this topic somewhere, but the short one I would give is I think that trans representation in video games is getting better, but it's doing so in a slightly uneven way, and I'm sort of not surprised by that. Where we're seeing the most consistent improvement and the fewest caveats to give is in terms of representation of trans men in video games.
Okay.
And there are some really, really wonderful examples of trans men characters in video games that have really, really been sort of coming together in the last few years. Krem in Dragon Age Inquisition was a largely very well handled character in a sprawling RPG who had other in-universe characters standing up for his identity and like being very supportive. Last year, it might have been the year before, Tell Me Why is a fantastic choose your own adventure sort of mystery game with a trans man main character. It is one of the best examples I've seen of a trans character in a piece of media that has a lot of touches that just feel very believable and real. There's a lot of little touches that you go, oh yeah, no, some cis person reading a diagnostic criteria wouldn't have come up with that detail, and that's the kind of things that are really nice to see. Like at one point in that game, there is a journal that this trans man character kept during childhood, and it's one of those things where like I was bracing myself for this to be a moment where this character was going to get dead named or something, but no. Any time that the character refers to themselves in their journal growing up, you see a scribble and you can't see what's under it. And it was a bunch of trying out different nicknames and trying out different masculine coded names for themselves, but not so masculine that like parents were going to catch on to what was happening, but
Yeah.
definitely like it was the real vibe of I'm trying to find a name that fits me that I like. And it's like, that's wonderful. In terms of trans woman representation in games, things are a lot more all over the place.
Yeah.
We're seeing some wonderful examples in the indie space, and like the indie space is providing a lot of trans creators space to tell their own stories. But outside of that, we're seeing a lot of like very mishandled and awkwardly handled examples. One of the most prominent big AAA games in recent years to have a trans woman character in it was Mass Effect Andromeda, which was a game in which a bunch of people decide to go to the complete opposite end of space, and you have a conversation with this trans woman, and the very first conversation you have is, "Hi, I left the Milky Way to get away from my dead name. I didn't want people misgendering me and dead naming me. Anyway, here's my dead name that I wanted to escape from."
That's so weird.
Like, yeah, like leaving the entire galaxy to get away from your dead name and then divulging that dead name in your first conversation with a stranger is like very strange.
Yeah.
One of the ones I have more complicated feelings on, and I'll try and keep this quick, is at the time it released, one of the best examples we had for a while of a game that felt like it was respectful to a playable trans woman protagonist was a game called J.J. McField and the Island of Memories, which is, in a vacuum, a really sweet, if a little emotionally heavy game about a trans woman. A little content warning here for a second, but her mum's trying to put her through conversion therapy and she attempts to take her own life, and the game is her in her head coming to terms with, no, I want to live and I want to push through this, and ultimately at the end being very supported by her girlfriend, despite like in the last scenes of the game not having her wig on, having a chest exposed, still being validated as a woman and still being seen as who she was. And it was quite a moving piece of art at the time, until the creator of that game started saying no one is wrong for being who they are, including this trans character's mother who tried to force her into conversion therapy. Everyone's okay to be who they are. And then he released his next game in which murderous incestuous trans woman is misgendered for many, many, many hours, and it became clear that this was not a good piece of representation, but an accident stumbled into. And
yeah,
I feel like we're trending in the direction of, I think in the next like maybe 2 years, we will see a big budget game with a prominent trans woman character that is like critically well received. I feel like we're on the precipice of that, but we are dancing around right now in a space where I think a lot of developers who want to have a trans character prominently in a piece of media have decided that it is safer or easier, or that have decided that trans man is the way to go. And we're just on the precipice of trying to see like some developer take the step and also do something similar with a trans woman character.
That's disappointing to hear that about JJ McField. I really liked
Yeah.
that game, and
Yeah. So
I didn't
so
realize
so
the
did yeah.
complicated kind of
No,
comments from the creator.
I really liked it too until Deadly Premonition 2 released, and that entire game was an
Yeah.
excuse to just over and over and over misgender a trans woman. And yeah, a lot of the
Ugh,
retroactive interviews about JJ McField really make me feel differently about it, which is a
ugh.
shame because in isolation, it's a beautiful piece of work.
I'm glad I avoided Deadly Premonition too, then.
Yeah, it's not good. I think that one of the longest videos that I posted on accessibility was like 45 minutes of me complaining about trans representation in Deadly Premonition
Oh
2.
gosh.
It was a dense video. There was a lot to complain about.
Because I've seen in a couple like major games like some pretty bad representation, but that sounds like that might take the cake. So I
It
feel like a
it
lot of games from
yeah.
Atlas tend to not have the best.
I, Look, at least Atlas games will tend to condense down the queerphobic content to like
Yeah.
one scene that you can brace through and it's done. It's
Hmm.
not usually game long as
Like
a running
throughout.
joke.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like I love like Persona 5, but there are definitely scenes in that I will have to wince through.
Yeah, I haven't played that yet, but I've definitely heard that.
Yeah.
So kind of connecting some of the pieces you talked about, because I feel like who we see or don't see in media like video games
Mhm.
definitely influences like how we interact with media, what media we do or don't choose to play in the case of games. So I'm wondering if you see in any ways that like representation in and of itself is like a form of accessibility and how that's intertwined with accessibility, like in addition to all the other pieces you've discussed.
I grew up playing a lot of video games that did not represent me or my experience, and there just was not an option to see myself represented really, and I, didn't let that stop me enjoying games. It was not a barrier to me playing games full stop, but it was a barrier to me feeling connected to games when I view it in hindsight.
Hmm.
You don't realize how much you want representation until you have it,
Yeah.
and the ways it can be meaningful until it's there. I remember the first time I played through like a big series of video games as a female character. It was the Mass Effect series. Like I'd played individual games here and there with interesting, good female leads, but getting to play through like three big RPGs back to back with a sort of continuing story with this character that I could craft to feel somewhat like me, to feel like represented me in some way, was a really big deal. And I look back on why that game meant so much to me and why it felt so emotionally resonant with me. And a big part of it was not having to pretend that this was someone else's story in a
Hmm.
way that is hard to put to words. There is a subtle but intangible difference between I feel like I am playing through a bunch of stories that tell me that these stories happen to other people and not to me, and getting to play through a story where you can look at it and go, oh, that could be me.
Hmm.
And I'm allowed to dream of that being me. And
Yeah.
I think that means it makes a big difference. Just having slightly less of a barrier between yourself, like perceived between yourself and the art you're experiencing, can just make it a little easier to feel like it's to make it feel a little more personal. And it's hard to know how much it's going to mean to you until you experience it.
Yeah, I love that. Like I think I mean similarly it sounds like when, I was growing up with games, like there's very few options to see myself
Yeah,
or me, I was like trying to find like
yeah.
any game I could where it's like, oh, I could play as the woman character. And even that was
Oh,
rare. growing
I've
up.
I've thought of an example I want to talk about for a second.
Yeah.
There's a video game called To the Moon.
Mm,
That is it's maybe 4 or 5 hours long, and it's not particularly gameplay heavy. The premise as pitched initially to the player is you're in a sort of near future where there is technology to rewrite someone's memories on their deathbed. And there's this old man on his deathbed who wants to have his memories rewritten so that like he looks back on his life and at some point in his life went to the moon, and he doesn't know why he wants this, but he wants this to be how he remembers his life. And what the game ultimately is about is the story of two autistic women in his life, and particularly one autistic woman he was married to, that he had some difficulty communicating with at times.
mm,
And that game was a lot of firsts for me, not just in video games, but like overall in media. Depictions of autistic people in media tend to be solely focused on men. A lot of that is down to decades old uh, diagnostic criteria imbalances, 90s debunked theories about autism being the product of an extreme male brain, things like this, that mean that autism is thought of colloquially as something that men have. And you
mhm,
don't see a lot of women with autism depicted. They have a more difficult time getting diagnosed. But you also tend to only see depictions of autism from single characters in pieces of media. And autism is a spectrum. It is a spectrum condition, and a single depiction of a character with autism is usually going to lean one way or another and not be sort of fully encompassing of
mhm,
what autism as a condition is. Not only did I get to see a piece of media centering on an autistic woman, I got to see two autistic women who had very different experiences and verbalized them in ways that were really resonant. That game deals with the dueling difficulties between uh, autistic people who are diagnosed young and get support early on, but aren't pressured to learn masking techniques to sort of pretend to the outside world that they're not autistic, as opposed
mhm,
to people who are diagnosed later in life who have had to learn through trauma those skills to suppress themselves, and the act of after getting diagnosed having to learn to unpack and go, who am I behind all of the walls I've had to build to survive. That game deals with really nuanced conversations about the feelings of isolation as an autistic person, wanting to socially connect with other people and struggling to be heard. Uh,
mhm,
and that pressure often being put on you to communicate differently, not on the other person to, communicate differently who isn't autistic. It is a beautiful piece of art.
mhm,
It makes me cry so much, but
mhm,
there are several passages in that game that I have used to explain things that I have experienced to other people, because it put things I things that I'd experienced and had no words for, it put to words
mhm.
for me. And that's what good representation can do, I think. It can help you go, not only am I not alone with this feeling, but here is something to help me explain to people outside of myself what I am going through.
I could just
So
see as you were talking about that, like how like impactful that was. And like I've
yeah,
heard of that game and I've wanted to play it for a long time, but I had no idea like
it's
anything beyond like the like little intro bit about
yeah,
changing memories.
yeah. I recognize like I've got a bit into the sort of deeper plot there, but I don't think it spoils the
It makes me
experience.
want to
But
play it more.
yeah, it's that game means a lot to me. Yeah.
I love that. Like I feel like those are the type of games that's part of the reason why like I
Yes.
love games that can tell those like powerful stories. It's what keeps me
So
coming back to
yeah,
video games.
those are the things that made me want to write about games in the first place. The things that can make you have those kind of powerful experiences that you were a part of, that you had
Mhm.
some degree in agency in something that moved you in that kind of way.
Yeah, I wanted to take a moment to talk a little bit about like some of the books you've written. And I
Yeah,
see these are also connected to like video games and
yeah,
representation. Like first of all, I know you've wrote this book, or edited this book, Gender Euphoria, full of like
Mm.
a collection of different stories of trans and non-binary people's experiences. And just I see this as like, a piece of like really sharing multiple stories, providing more representation for diversity in the community. Wondering if you could tell us a little bit like how this book came to be, the inspiration behind it.
Gender Euphoria as a book was really born out of the initial idea sprouted in around 2016, and it was when the UK was starting to experience the beginnings of a real rise in negative media coverage of the trans community. This was around the time of attempts to reform the UK's Gender Recognition Act, and this sort of was a big rallying cry for the anti-trans movement, and probably like the birth of modern British transphobia. At the time, even back in 2016, it was very clear that a tide was turning and that we were heading towards what was going to be a very stark increase in negative coverage of the trans community. And that was overwhelming. And it was an overwhelming thing to experience. And initially, when I was thinking about the book, it was purely about the fact that I thought there was value in trying to change some of the conversation around the trans community, because so often we are expected to deal in conversations of tragedy, be it diagnostic criteria for things like gender dysphoria requiring talking about lived experience in terms of I am struggling with blank and my
Mhm.
existence is sort of defined by that, to having to combat waves of disinformation that paint the trans community as, whatever the monstrous claim of the week is. But trans lives are so much more than that. When I think about myself and when I speak to trans people day to day, our lives, like most of us, our lives day to day are much more defined by the little acts of joy we have. They are just us living our lives and the moments between the crises that the world makes us have to deal with. And this idea sat on the back burner for a little bit. It was something I wanted to do, and it took a little while to get off the ground, just in terms of I wanted to find the right contributors and I wanted to make sure that like I could pay people up front for their work and like get everything done properly. The real catalyst for that book happening in earnest was in 2020. Everything really started to ramp up in terms of like anti-trans hate. There was another very big notable push in anti-trans hate starting to surface, and that lined up with the start of the pandemic. And I remember having this moment of realizing I'd come to rely on in-person community events to keep myself feeling upbeat and not worn down by all of the misery of having to deal with, institutional transphobia. And I was like, you know, pride events aren't going to be happening in 2020. Trans pride's not going to be happening. I'm not going to have those community moments of sort of recharging the battery, as it were.
Yeah.
And I needed something for myself to focus on working on that was full of joy and happiness. I had a feeling that by the time that it came out, it was probably going to be even more the case that the community was going to need some focusing on joy and happiness. And that's when I really sat down and was like, I need to do the book and I need to do it now, because I needed to focus on something happy and positive around our community. And I felt like I needed to put some joy and positivity out there, and it all just sort of was a natural fit. It was an excuse for me to find a bunch of examples of different ways that joy can look in our community from around the world, and try and paint as vivid a picture as I could of the breadth of experiences of joy that
Mhm.
were out there.
Like you're saying, that's so important in a world where, like, so often we're, like you're saying, defined by our pain, our struggles, our hardships, where it's like those are obviously important to consider as they're very real part of a lot of our lived experiences. But it's just, we can't
Yeah.
discredit like all of the positives and all of the nuance and all of the so many pieces that make up who we are.
As I say at the start of that anthology, I don't I didn't put that anthology together to deny that we have challenges we have to go
Hmm.
through as a community, but that it's important for us that are at a point in our journeys where we are happy to sit and, reflect on that feeling and hold it close and remember that it's there. It's important for people who are just starting their journeys to be able to see hope and to go,
Hmm.
I can reach a point where my journey will be more about its joy than the suffering to get there. It was important for people outside of the trans community to see the normal lived lives of trans people and the fact that at the end of the day we're just people trying to be happy,
Hmm.
and embracing those aspects of joy doesn't take doesn't you don't have to pretend that sadness doesn't exist to also look at the joy.
Exactly. Like it's both and like they both
Yeah.
exist. Last question, probably a little less serious. But I feel like I have to ask, what's the story behind your book, Things I Learned from Mario's Butts?
So this probably goes back as far as any story in me writing about video games could go. I used to, before I was full time writing about video games, I was working a supermarket job, and that job ended pretty abruptly. I'd been working that job like 3, 4 years, never a problem. I came out as trans, and I can't prove this is connected, but
Hmm.
within 2 weeks of coming out, suddenly there were complaints about me, and oh, I've got to be let
Hmm.
go. And I decided to take the plunge. I was like, if there's ever a time for me to start writing about video games full time, it's now. I
Hmm.
had a little bit of savings saved up, and I was like, I can afford to spend 2 weeks trying to get to launch a Patreon and get it to a point where I can just scrape by for another month and like get to a point where it's going to be rough, but I can live on it. And if that doesn't work, I've got enough in the bank to for one more month, so I can find a different like a regular job, and that's fine. So that first 2 weeks, I set up a Patreon, and I wish I could find the original tweet that inspired this, but I put a tweet out that basically said something to the effect of, if you enjoy my writing, is there something that I could write about that if I did, you'd go, yeah, I'll give you $1 a month on Patreon for that? And someone tweeted back, and I don't know who it was. Whoever it is out there that spiraled this arm of my career simply tweeted, I'd pay you $1 a month to review video game character butts. And I retweeted it. I retweeted it as a joke. I thought, oh, that's funny. And I had maybe 50 people tweet back in response to that tweet saying, yeah, I'll give you $1 a month if you do that. And I was like,
Love that.
okay, look, I'd really like to make this writing thing work. And I was like, I don't want to do this unless I have a take on it that feels like something meaningful I could bring to that discussion. And what eventually became of that tweet was a video series called Laura's Gaming Butts. And the approach that I tried to take with it was silly but serious critique. Like, ha ha ha, we're going to talk about butts. But when you stop and think about it, there's a lot of things in terms of like character design and choices made around how you design characters, or in a weirdly large number of cases, plot points and characterization in video games are directly related to video game character butts. And the more I thought about it, the more I was like, the idea here is take this so seriously and like do the genuine research that the joke is, wait, this isn't a joke, there's actual research in here. um I think back to some of the early examples that like made me think that this was something I could have fun doing was the Metal Gear Solid series has a lot of very plot critical butts, from the character of Meryl, who the protagonist Solid Snake has to recognize her by her butt. She's in disguise as a soldier. She looks the same as all the other soldiers, but he saw her butt when she was working out in a window earlier. If he can recognize that butt, he'll know which of the soldiers is her, and he can
Oh my
squirrel
gosh.
her away and go, "It's you. We need to rendezvous." There is a character with IBS, and his IBS is plot critical to how he doesn't get taken over by mind controlling nanomachines. Um,
Okay.
it's like the more you start looking into these things, the more you start realizing like there's a weirdly large number of like stories of how video game character butts are relevant to the way that we design games and design characters and tell stories. And like that series was a little joke that like it was a semi-regular video series I did for a laugh with people, and it had its moments of occasionally like it occasionally had some moments that made me think maybe there was some room to it. I did an interview with video game developer Mike Bithell once for that series where we spent 45 minutes talking about how the plot of the indie game Thomas Was Alone was secretly entirely about butts, and every character's character art was just about butts. And that sticks with me a lot because, like, Mike Bithell took that interview so seriously. He committed to the bit and was willing to spend 45 minutes straight-faced saying that his work of art that like people critically acclaimed, oh no, I'm being deadly serious. Every plot point is about butts. That it made me go, there is a real realm of like people who just want to have some silly fun who would
Mhm.
probably get involved in this. And when I eventually pitched it as a book, I was like, I'm going to reach out to a bunch of people in the games industry and see if they'd be interested in contributing. And a lot of like my dream people I would love to contribute in games, I was like, I'll send them a message. They'll, it's a long shot. They'll never say yes. Not one person I reached out to didn't respond with, "This is amazing. Of course,
I
I'll write about
love
butts,
that.
butts for your book." Because like I've had conversations with some of those contributors afterwards, and their response was just, it's so silly. When am I ever going to get a chance to be this serious about butts in print ever again? Of course I'll do it. And like I think people needed like it the cross section of I feel like I'm learning and putting effort in, but the premise is just very nonsensical. Was it caught a lot of people's attention and it was very fun to work on.
Love that. It sounds like an amazing project. It sounds like everybody who heard about it was like, this, why
It
hasn't this
it
existed already?
apparently it's a really easy sales pitch to tell
Yeah,
people video game character butts, but we take them very seriously.
so funny.
There what one of the pages in that book that I think back on a lot is games critic from IGN called Brian Altano wrote an entire poem about the main character from Bloodborne trying not to shit himself in fear every time he saw a scary monster. And it's the most beautiful piece of like written poetry I've heard in a long time. Like it's so eloquently structured. He
Oh
clearly
my
put so
God.
much work into it for a poem about trying not to shit yourself. And I was like, this is
That's
what the
amazing.
project was about.
That's really the underlying story of Bloodborne. That was actually the end of my questions, except for kind of like the final one of like, is there anything else that you wanted to speak about that we didn't touch on, or any other projects you wanted to plug or
The main thing I would plug that we didn't talk about today is I have other books, some of which are out now and some of which are coming up. Uncomfortable Labels is a memoir that I wrote about living at the intersection of being trans and autistic. Me and My Dysphoria Monster is an illustrated children's book of sort of discussing gender dysphoria in child approachable language.
Mhm.
I also have another book coming out later this year that is very similar to Gender Euphoria, but
Okay.
about stories of autistic joy.
Oh, wonderful.
That'll be coming out later this year. I can't say much more about it at this point, but
Mhm.
if if you enjoy Gender Euphoria, there is something very similar coming this year. And I have a book that I wrote with my wife, a novel called Who Hunts the Whale, which is a satirical novel set in a fictional AAA video game development studio that is definitely not inspired by real world video game studios sort of pastiched together. It's definitely fiction.
Definitely not. Heard it here. Well, yeah, so thank you again for taking the time to be here today. I hope for, all my audience, this is interesting and informative, entertaining, insert exciting adjective here. I'll be sure to include like, links to your YouTube website, information about your books, your podcasts in the description below. So, if anybody watching wants to go out and learn more about the work you've done, it'll make it easy for them. And for everyone in the audience, please share your thoughts below. You know, anything you learn from what Laura shared, anything resonate with you, or do you just want to share your love and appreciation for the work that Laura does, or just your love and appreciation for video game buds, whatever it may be? Let us know down in the comments below. Thank you again so much. Like
Thank you for
this,
having me.
yeah,
It's been lovely.
this was wonderful. But, as always, be sure everyone to hit that subscribe and like button. Tipsy my cat wherever she is, and I love you all. Thank you so much for watching, and bye for now.